I still remember the way my mother said it. Soft, apologetic, almost rehearsed, as if she had practiced the lines in front of a mirror before stepping into my room. She stood in the doorway of my small bedroom, one hand gripping the doorframe, the other clutching a folded receipt like proof of hardship. "We just can't afford it this year," she said gently. "Things are tight. You understand, right?" Her voice carried that familiar tone, the one that made refusal sound reasonable and disappointment feel selfish. I looked up from my desk, where acceptance letters and unpaid bills lay scattered together, and nodded. Because that's what good daughters do. They nod. They swallow questions. They learn early that love in some families comes with conditions. I was 19, newly accepted into a local college after giving up on my dream school because it was too expensive. I worked part-time at a cafe, opening early mornings and closing late nights, trying to stretch every paycheck. My dreams were bigger than my bank account, but I was learning how to shrink them quietly. The vacation had been planned for months. Europe, Paris, Rome, Barcelona. My parents had talked about it endlessly at dinner like it was a family project, showing glossy brochures, arguing over landmarks, laughing about how much walking there would be. My mother had once asked me which city I wanted to see the most. I'd said Paris without hesitation. She smiled that night. I held on to that smile for weeks. And then suddenly I was no longer part of the conversation. "It's just for us," my father said later that evening, his eyes glued to his phone as if the screen mattered more than my reaction. "We need a break. We'll bring you something nice." Something nice. As if a souvenir could replace memories. As if a keychain could stand in for family photos I wouldn't be in. I told myself it made sense. I always did. My parents had spent my entire childhood reminding me how expensive I was. Tuition, uniforms, books, food, electricity, space. I'd grown up hearing the word sacrifice like it was my middle name. "We do everything for you," my mother liked to say, usually right after denying me something. So when they said we were broke, I believed them without question. I stayed home. I picked up extra shifts. I skipped meals some days, telling myself it was budgeting, not hunger. I avoided asking for anything, even essentials, because I didn't want to be a burden. I felt guilty for wanting more, for wanting to be included, for wanting to feel chosen. The day they left, I hugged them goodbye at the airport. Coach class drop-off. No drama. No tears. Just fluorescent lights, rolling suitcases, and people rushing past us toward better destinations. My mom kissed my forehead and whispered, "Next time, okay? Next time." Another promise that felt light enough to disappear. I watched them walk away, their backs turned, suitcases trailing behind them. They never once looked back. I stood there longer than I should have, pretending to scroll through my phone, so no one would notice the way my chest felt hollow. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed. A message from my cousin. "Wait, are your parents traveling today too? I just saw them at the airport lounge." Lounge? I frowned at the screen, confusion spreading slowly, like ink in water. Before I could reply, another message came through. A photo. There they were. My parents. Smiling. Glasses of champagne raised casually, seated comfortably in a first-class cabin. Wide leather seats. White tablecloths. Real glassware. My mother leaned toward my father, laughing. Her face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. On her wrist gleamed the gold bracelet she claimed she pawned last year to help pay bills. My hand started shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I stared at the image until my eyes burned. Zoomed in. Zoomed out. As if the truth might change if I looked at it differently. My chest tightened, not with anger at first, but with something colder and deeper, humiliation. The kind that seeps into your bones and whispers, "You were never part of the plan." They weren't broke. They never were. They just didn't want me there. Every excuse replayed itself in my head like a cruel montage. Every time they said, "Maybe next year." Every birthday forgotten because things were tight. Every lecture about gratitude. Every reminder that I should be thankful for what I had. That night I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't confront them. I sat on my bed in the dark, phone resting in my lap, the photo glowing like evidence of a crime no one else could see. I replayed every memory with new eyes, realizing how often I had been the afterthought, the expense, the inconvenience. I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. I had never been included. I had been tolerated. Something inside me shifted then. Quietly. Permanently. I didn't know what I was going to do yet. I didn't have a plan or a script for revenge. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never let myself be invisible again. That lie, one sentence, one photo had just rewritten my future. And as I stared at the ceiling, heart steady and mind sharp, I made a silent promise to myself. If they wanted to pretend I didn't exist, I'd make sure they remembered me forever. Revenge doesn't always begin with anger. Sometimes it begins with silence. After that night, the night the photo burned itself into my memory, I changed in ways no one noticed. Not dramatically. Not loudly. I didn't slam doors or demand explanations. I didn't confront them or accuse them of lying. I simply stopped asking. Stopped hoping. Stopped expecting anything more than what they had already shown me they were willing to give. Silence became my armor. I spoke when spoken to. I smiled when required. I answered questions with safe, neutral words. I became polite, distant, and conveniently forgettable, just the way they seemed to prefer me. If they wanted me small, I would be invisible instead. When they returned from their trip, they were glowing. Sun-kissed skin, new clothes, that lightness people carry when they've been indulged without guilt. They talked about the food, the hotels, the great deals they'd found. I listened from the kitchen doorway like a guest in my own home. My mother handed me a souvenir magnet shaped like the Eiffel Tower. It was cheap plastic already scratched. "See," she said, smiling as if she'd kept a promise. "We told you we'd bring something." I thanked her. I even smiled. That was the last lie I ever accepted from them. From that point on, I stopped explaining myself. I didn't justify my choices or defend my exhaustion. I let them assume whatever they wanted, that I was struggling, that I was barely getting by, that I needed guidance. Correcting them would have required trust, and trust was already gone. Instead, I poured everything into work. I took 2 jobs. Sometimes 3. Morning shifts that started before sunrise. Night shifts that ended when the city went quiet. I studied between breaks, slept in fragments, lived on coffee and determination. I learned how to stretch a paycheck until it felt like a magic trick. I learned the difference between need and want, and how to deny myself both. More importantly, I learned skills. Digital marketing, graphic design, copywriting, freelancing. Anything that could be learned online and paid for remotely, I learned. I watched tutorials late at night with headphones on, scribbling notes while the rest of the house slept. I failed quietly, improved quietly, succeeded quietly. While my parents posted vacation photos and expensive dinners online, captioned with words like blessed and hard-earned, I built something in the background. Brick by brick, client by client, payment by payment. They never noticed. To them, I was still the struggling daughter. The one who lived modestly. The one who should be careful with money. The one who needed advice. They offered guidance I didn't ask for and warnings I no longer needed. I nodded. I listened. I let them believe they were wiser. When I moved out, they didn't protest. No tears. No concern. Just a casual. "That's probably for the best." When I stopped calling regularly, they didn't ask why. Weeks passed. Then months. And that hurt more than the lie ever had. Because lies can be confronted. Indifference is harder to forgive. There were nights I lay awake in my small rented room, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I could miss people who barely noticed my absence. But pain has a way of sharpening focus. Instead of breaking me, it disciplined me. By 26, I had my own apartment. Small but mine. Every piece of furniture paid for with money I earned myself. By 28, I registered my own company. Nothing flashy. Just solid, growing, profitable. By 30, my income quietly surpassed theirs. They never knew. I never posted about it. Never celebrated online. Never announced milestones. I dressed the same. Spoke the same. Let them believe whatever version of me was most comfortable for them. Let them underestimate me. Because revenge isn't loud at first. It doesn't announce itself. It waits. It waits until the balance shifts. Until roles reverse. Until the ones who once held power begin to feel uncertain. That moment came on an ordinary evening. I was finishing work when my phone rang. My father's name lit up the screen. We rarely spoke now, so I answered immediately. "We're thinking of selling the house," he said casually, as if discussing the weather. Property taxes are getting ridiculous. Repairs too. We might need some help. Help. The word echoed in my head, heavy and familiar. For years I had been the one who needed help. The expensive one. The burden. The problem to be managed. Now suddenly they needed me. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel satisfying. Not enough to alarm him, but enough to remind myself of how far I'd come. I understand, I said gently, mirroring my mother's old tone perfectly. Of course. Anything I can do. He sounded relieved, grateful even. As I ended the call, I smiled, not with joy, not with anger, but with clarity. That was the moment the plan truly began. Quietly, patiently, on my terms. I offered to help them manage their finances like it was the most natural thing in the world. No drama, no edge in my voice, just a calm, reasonable suggestion delivered with concern. You've done so much for me, I said lightly. It's the least I can do. They were thrilled. Finally, their daughter was being useful. Finally, I was stepping into the role they always believed I should play, supportive, responsible, grateful. My father handed over documents without hesitation. My mother shared passwords scribbled on sticky notes, bank statements, investment summaries, credit reports. What they didn't know was that I saw everything. Not just the numbers but the story behind them. The hidden credit card debt spread across multiple accounts. Each one maxed just enough to pretend it wasn't a problem. The risky investments my father had made based on tips from friends who were always one step ahead. Until they weren't. The unpaid taxes quietly accumulating penalties. The lifestyle they could no longer afford but refused to give up. They had been living on momentum and denial. Years of pretending finally caught up with them just as they had pretended I wasn't there. I felt no rush of satisfaction. No sudden anger. Just a steady, almost clinical awareness. They were standing on rotten floorboards and all it would take was time. I didn't sabotage them. I didn't manipulate numbers or hide information. I didn't push them toward disaster. I simply let them keep making the same choices with encouragement. When my mother mentioned another luxury vacation, her eyes lighting up like they always did, I smiled and nodded. You deserve it, I said warmly. You've worked hard your whole lives. I even helped her compare hotels, pointing out the ones with the best reviews. When my father hesitated about selling the house, pacing the living room with worry etched into his face, I reassured him. Real estate always bounces back, I said confidently. If you sell now, you'll regret it later. They trusted me completely. Why wouldn't they? I was calm, capable. I never judged them, never said no outright. I made them feel smart, respected, in control, everything they had once denied me. Months passed and the cracks began to show. The market dipped unexpectedly. Interest rates rose. Investments stalled then sank. Credit card minimums climbed higher each month. Savings accounts drained faster than they could pretend not to notice. The confidence in my father's voice thinned. My mother stopped buying new clothes. The phone calls started coming more often. We're just a little short this month, my mother said one evening, trying to sound casual. It's temporary, my father added another time. Things will turn around. And then the line I had heard my entire life. You know we do the same for you. I transferred small amounts at first. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to help. Just enough to keep them afloat. Just enough to establish a new rhythm. Dependence. They thanked me profusely at first. Told relatives how proud they were. How responsible I'd become. How lucky they were to have such a caring daughter. I listened. I smiled. I kept notes. Each transfer shifted something subtle between us. The tone of their voices changed. Requests replaced advice. Gratitude replaced authority. They no longer spoke down to me. They checked in. Asked how I was doing. Asked what I thought. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it slips quietly into place. Then came the house. They had waited too long. The market wasn't kind. Offers came in low. Desperation forced their hand. When the house finally sold, it was at a loss. After fees, repairs, and back taxes, there was far less left than they'd expected. They didn't say it outright, but the truth hung in the air. They had nowhere else to go. Renting would drain what little they had left. Friends were suddenly unavailable. Pride limited their options. And so, eventually carefully my father brought it up. "We were wondering," he began, clearing his throat, "if maybe we could stay with you for a bit. Just until we figure things out." I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, long enough for discomfort to settle in. Long enough for them to feel just slightly what it was like to wait for approval. Then I said, "Why don't you come over for dinner? We can talk." That night, they arrived at my apartment dressed modestly, eyes scanning the space they hadn't known existed. The clean lines, the view, the quiet confidence of ownership. My mother commented on the furniture. My father asked about the neighborhood. I served dinner calmly, politely. Wine poured into proper glasses. Plates arranged carefully. Halfway through the meal, my mother smiled nervously. "You've done so well for yourself," she said. "We're really proud." I met her eyes, holding the gaze just a second longer than necessary. "I learned from the best," I replied. They laughed, relieved. They didn't yet realize this wasn't a reunion. It was a reckoning. The tables had turned, not with shouting or accusations, but with patience, precision, and memory. Every word they'd ever used on me, every excuse, every dismissal, I hadn't forgotten. And as they sat there, hopeful and unaware, I knew one thing with certainty. This was only the beginning. We met at a restaurant near the airport. I chose it deliberately, not because it was convenient but because it mattered. Airports are places of departure and arrival, of goodbyes and revelations. This one overlooked the runways where planes taxied slowly, engines humming with promise. The restaurant itself was expensive. Linen tablecloths, low lighting, the quiet confidence of a place that didn't need to announce its prices. I arrived early. I wore simple clothes, neutral colors, nothing flashy, no designer labels, no obvious signals of success. I wanted to look calm, ordinary, unremarkable. I wanted them relaxed. When they walked in together, I saw the hesitation immediately. My mother paused just inside the doorway, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the polished wood, the wine displays, the discreetly dressed staff. My father straightened his jacket, suddenly aware of how worn it was. "This place is fancy," my mother whispered as she slid into her chair, lowering her voice like someone afraid of being overheard. I smiled gently. "I like it." The waiter came. Water was poured. Menus opened. Small talk followed, safe, shallow conversation about traffic, about how busy the airport looked, about nothing at all. I listened more than I spoke, watching them carefully. They were nervous. Not just because of the restaurant, because something felt different. They could sense it even if they didn't understand it yet. The balance between us had shifted, and they were still adjusting to the weight of it. Dinner arrived. They ate cautiously, choosing modest dishes despite the menu's extravagance. Old habits, old fears. I noticed how my mother kept glancing at prices, how my father avoided ordering wine. Halfway through the meal, I reached into my bag. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my phone on the table and slid it toward them. A single photo filled the screen. The same one my cousin had sent me years ago. The one burned into my memory. Champagne glasses raised. Wide leather seats. First-class smiles. My mother's gold bracelet catching the light. Their faces drained of color instantly. My father's hand froze mid-motion. My mother stared at the screen as if it might disappear if she looked long enough. "You remember this?" I asked softly. My voice was steady, controlled. "The day you told me we were broke." Silence swallowed the table. Around us, cutlery clinked. Conversations continued. A plane roared faintly in the distance. But at our table, time felt suspended. "I stayed home," I continued calmly. "I worked double shifts. I skipped meals. I believed you." I leaned back slightly, giving them space they didn't deserve but needed. "You flew first class." My father opened his mouth, then closed it. No words came out. For once, his confidence had nowhere to land. My mother's eyes filled with tears. She reached for a napkin, hands trembling. "We didn't think you'd understand," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You were young. We thought it was better this way." I nodded slowly. "You were right." They looked up at me, hopeful for just a second. "I didn't understand," I finished. "But not for the reasons you think." My mother began to cry quietly, shoulders shaking. My father stared at the table, jaw clenched, finally seeing what he had avoided for years. "This isn't about the trip," I said evenly. "It never was. It's about the lie. About deciding I wasn't worth the truth. About making me feel like a burden so you could feel comfortable." Neither of them interrupted. I stood up. The movement startled them, as if they'd expected me to keep sitting, keep explaining, keep forgiving. That was the old version of me. "I've already arranged a place for you," I said calmly. "It's affordable. Modest. Safe." They looked at me confused. "Not luxury," I added. "Not first class. Coach class living." I reached into my wallet and placed cash on the table. "Enough to cover dinner. Enough to be polite. Nothing more. This will take care of tonight," I said. "Everything else has been handled." My mother reached for my hand. "Please," she said softly. "We did the best we could." I stepped back gently, not unkindly but firmly. "So did I," I replied. I turned and walked away. Past the tables. Past the bar. Toward the glass windows overlooking the runway. A plane lifted into the night sky, lights blinking, climbing steadily upward. I felt no joy. No thrill. No sense of victory. Just peace. The kind that comes when the truth is finally spoken, and nothing more needs to be said. They moved into a small apartment on the edge of town. Nothing dramatic. No confrontation, no final argument, no slammed doors. Just boxes packed quietly, a lease signed without celebration, and a life downsized into something more honest than they'd lived in years. The place is modest, 2 rooms, thin walls, aging paint. Coach class living, just as I'd promised. We don't talk much anymore. Sometimes my mother texts. Short messages. Safe ones. "Hope you're well. Just checking in." Sometimes my father leaves voicemails he deletes halfway through. I know because the phone rings, then stops, then rings again hours later with something brief and awkward. They don't ask for help now. They don't offer advice either. We exist in a careful distance. And strangely, that distance feels healthier than anything we ever had before. I don't hate them. That's the part people expect, the part that makes a better story. But hatred requires energy, and I've spent too many years conserving mine just to survive. What I feel now is quieter than anger and heavier than forgiveness. I finally see them clearly. Not as villains. Not as monsters. Just as deeply flawed people who chose comfort over honesty, convenience over care. People who convinced themselves they were doing the right thing because the alternative would have required accountability. Revenge didn't change them. Changed me. For most of my life, I shrank myself to fit the space they allowed me. I apologized for existing, for needing, for wanting. I learned how to make myself smaller so others could feel bigger. I confused endurance with love and silence with loyalty. That version of me doesn't exist anymore. Somewhere along the way, between late nights, quiet victories, and hard-earned independence, I stopped asking permission to take up space. I stopped explaining my choices. I stopped believing love had to be earned through sacrifice. I learned that being excluded wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of their limits. The quiet years taught me discipline. The turning tables taught me power. But closure, that came later, unexpectedly, in moments so ordinary they almost felt invisible. Like waking up in my own apartment and realizing no one could take it away from me. Like making decisions without wondering how they'd react. Like booking flights without guilt. Sometimes when I travel now, when I walk through airports with my carry-on rolling smoothly behind me, I think of that girl standing at the terminal years ago. 19. Tired. Trying to be understanding. Watching her parents walk away without looking back. I see her clearly now. I see how hard she tried to be good. How quickly she believed she was the problem. How easily she accepted less because she didn't know she deserved more. When I take my seat on a plane now, when I settle into comfort, champagne in hand, window beside me, I don't feel triumph. I feel distance. Not physical distance but emotional distance from that pain. From that need to be chosen. From that quiet desperation to belong. Sometimes I imagine sitting beside that younger version of myself. I imagine leaning over and whispering the truth she couldn't see yet. One day you won't need revenge. You won't need explanations or apologies or acknowledgement. You won't need them to understand what they did or why it hurt. You'll need nothing from them at all. And that will be your freedom. Freedom isn't proving them wrong. It isn't watching them struggle. It isn't winning in a way they can see. Freedom is living so fully that their absence no longer defines you. Freedom is peace without permission. Freedom is choosing yourself not once but every day after. That is my first-class victory.